pleasure to welcome Professor Peter Gatrell, a foundational pillar of the field of refugee history, whose work emphasizes a refugee-focused approach to global history, but also theorizes how refugees have historically created different spheres of being beyond refugee regimes and the state-refugee nexus. Peter is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Manchester, where he taught Russian economic and social history, the cultural history of modern war, and refugee history. His latest book, which he's going to talk about a bit today, co-authored with Katarzyna Nowak, Lauren Baiko, and Anandita Ghoshal, is Refugee Voices in Modern Global History, published by Oxford University Press in 2025. He's currently working on a book provisionally titled Appointment in Geneva, Refugees Encounters with UNHCR 1951-1975. And I think I'll stop there and let you just dive into the book.
Well, thank you very much. This is the book, and I'll pass it around with the proviso that I must have it back. So thank you for coming. Yes, just by way of introduction, this book is a collaborative piece of authorship. It's based upon research that was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Leverhulme Trust. And basically, what we wanted to do was to analyse what refugees in different parts of the world, from the end of the First World War to the mid-1970s, said about their experiences and to whom they communicated their views, hopes and aspirations and expectations. And we drew primarily upon the letters and petitions that refugees wrote to those in authority who they believed had an obligation to respond. And those archives were found in different locations, government archives, for example, in India. But we also drew extensively on the archives of intergovernmental organisations, the League of Nations, in the interwar period, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the International Refugee Organization from 47 to 51, and UNHCR for the period after 1951. So I've written a paper which I think I'm going to have to go through quite quickly and possibly excise bits because I've only got 35 minutes. So just to emphasize that a book like this was not only collaborative but rested upon the research of numerous other scholars. Okay, so I'm not going to be mentioning names, although I might mention the names of people in this room, but just to say that we were conscious of the work of interdisciplinary refugee studies and the related fields thereof. It's a historical study. We didn't conduct an oral history. It's not an ethnography. It's archivally based. And because of our different backgrounds, we were able to consult sources in different countries, in different languages. So I want to emphasize that I'm speaking, as it were, on our collective behalf. But I want to go on to say something about my own research as it's developing. The subtitle of this book is Reckoning with Refugeedom. And some of you will be familiar with this term. Some of you may be tired of this term. But I do want to nail my colours to the Refugeedom mast, so to speak. It's a term that I appropriated from Russia during the First World War, a time of immense population displacement internal to the Russian Empire. And what, amongst other things, what interested me in this term was how it was an attempt to conceptualize a new social phenomenon. So Tsarist Russia was a very conservative society. People were assigned to different estates under the Tsar, but it was also a society that was undergoing industrialization. So there was an emergence of a poor peasantry and an organized working class. But here, in the First World War, with something like 7 million people displaced, was a new social reality and a new term that was being devised to accommodate it. So it was a way of describing a new social reality. It was also a way of thinking about the upheaval itself, the threat that refugees were deemed to pose to social and economic stability and to public health. But it was also significant because it crystallized and helped to legitimize new political organizations, around ethnicity, non-Russian refugees in particular, and that helped to mobilize them politically. So Refugeedom, in my understanding, is a way of thinking both about and beyond the refugee regime. Okay, so it's not a replacement for, but it's a way of thinking about certain kinds of developments and features that are not necessarily encapsulated in the notion of a refugee regime. So we examined the written record covering the period from 1919 to 1975, means that we took account of Russian and Armenian refugees after the First World War, stretched into the early post-Second World War period, looking at displaced persons, Polish and others, victims of Nazi forced recruitment during the Second World War. We were able to look at the impact of partition in South Asia and Bengali refugees who were resettled in independent India. We said something about Palestinian refugees and probably a fair bit more about refugees in sub-Saharan Africa. So the idea of thinking about voices was a way of trying to take account of the practical realities of what came to be called durable solutions, resettlement and repatriation. And we also examined the affective dimensions of displacement: fear, grief, humiliation, rage, hope, and determination. And we were especially interested in the audiences to whom refugees voiced political arguments or demands. Some refugees spoke primarily on their own personal behalf. For example, they wanted travel documents to enable them to resettle. They wanted funds to study further. They wanted funds to start a business, sometimes to trace missing relatives. Others, whom we discuss in the book, for example, Armenian refugees, Polish DPs, Bengali refugees, young Ethiopian refugees, voiced collective concerns about being abandoned or betrayed by governments that they thought had their interests at heart. And they advanced political projects, staunchly anti-communist in the case of Polish DPs, often radical leftist in the case of Bengali refugees. They understood the multiple constraints to which they were exposed, but they were also aware of potential resources from intergovernmental organizations, humanitarian aid agencies, diasporic groups, and others. And as individuals or as groups, they sought to hold authority to account. We detected performative elements in how they expressed themselves, such as demanding a response from high-profile political leaders and celebrities, or staging dramatic public protests, or simply by included sketches for added emphasis. We found evidence of political imagination, as in suggestions for new forums in which refugees would be represented, or proposals for a dedicated territory that could be earmarked for refugees, as when an Albanian woman wrote from Rome to Eleanor Roosevelt in 1955, quote, "We, millions of refugees, could form nearly an entire state, yet nobody thinks of putting it into action." Now, in my own work, I continue to draw upon, there are something like 25,000 case files in Geneva that comprise the letters that normally individuals, wrote to Geneva headquarters or to branch offices from different parts of the world. And these were then assembled and collated by UNHCR officers. Usually an approach came from an individual, sometimes from a third party, but it's important to stress that refugees and others took the initiative on their own account. Okay? They were not prompted by UNHCR. They were often required to fill out a template, a resettlement form, a registration document, but the original approach was often much less formal, improvised, freely composed, though this didn't stop some individuals from including a CV to add a degree of gravitas to their application. And as I've said, they come from all parts of the world, so you will expect to find Hungarian refugees after 1956 in the case files. You might not be expecting to find Uyghur refugees or Haitian refugees, and there were certainly large numbers of refugee students from sub-Saharan Africa, including those who were studying in the Soviet bloc. So these are case files. They served a legal and bureaucratic purpose. They're like other kinds of case files, the case files that you'd find in records of American social workers, for example, who were keen to demonstrate a kind of professional approach to social problems, systematic investigation, and documentation. The file was typically truncated, since refugees or their advocates were expected to provide relevant but brief factual evidence of persecution or loss of nationality as the basis for eligibility determination. As Otto Bayer, chief of the project's management section, put it in 1965, what is needed is not a well-meaning appeal, but a professional evaluation of the case. A nice illustration of the fact that decisions about legal recognition and assistance were often closely connected to clinical diagnosis and medical intervention. Nevertheless, many case files began with autobiographical background and grew in size as refugees engaged UNHCR in prolonged correspondence. Refugees often persisted in their requests, including making complaints about their treatment at its hands. In other words, to read the file is not just to become aware of a specific grievance or demand, but to realize that refugees did not necessarily accept what UNHCR said or instructed. The files bear witness to a constant exchange back and forth. Recognition was not a one-way process. Refugees looked to UNHCR officers to protect or assist them under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention or the UNHCR statute, but refugees also reflected on their relationship with UNHCR and could seek to hold the agency to account. Well, I have a short piece here, and I can say more about the work of other scholarship. I mean, there's a terrific book by Ruth Ballint, Australian historian, about the International Refugee Organization and the kind of files that the IRO accumulated. And obviously my account takes up where Ruth stopped. For example, UNHCR inherited from the IRO the eligibility manual and continued to add to it, and then eventually to create a new edition of the eligibility manual. Similarly, there's a very fine article by the American Lamis Abdelati, who examined the demands and grievances of Ethiopian, Somali, and Ugandan refugees who contacted UNHCR's office in the 1980s, early 1990s in support of collective rights. Their letters and petitions, she puts it, are not representative but indicative, and I think that's true of the case files that I'm looking at as well. She finds that UNHCR rarely engaged with refugees, but by contrast, the letters that I've examined show that officials almost always responded directly, even if it were to dismiss the request. All of this suggests the need to examine the terms, character, and outcomes of the encounter between refugees and officials. Although refugees had limited room for maneuver, they nevertheless deployed what James Scott famously called the weapons of the weak. These tactics were partly rhetorical. Some individuals announced themselves with a witty observation, as did Angolan refugee Edouard J., who wrote from Kinshasa in 1970. "If I write to you, it's not for the pure pleasure of putting pen to paper." Perhaps someone in UNHCR appreciated his arresting opening line. In any case, they referred him to the offices of World University Service so that he might complete his studies in Abidjan or Dakar. Among other weapons, sarcasm, bitterness, and talking back emerged in a voluminous correspondence, such as that generated by Velko R., originally from Montenegro, who pointedly said, "I refer to previous correspondence and very much regret to notice that you seem to take no notice of my really desperate situation. You should realize that your organization was created with the object of helping people like me and not to have soft chairs to sit on and play with the fate of poor refugees. You do not care because you enjoy life with the money destined for us." UNHCR's representative in Cairo dismissed his request for financial support and wrote him off as, quote, a mental case, thereby dismissing Velko's litany of persecution and his awareness of UNHCR's record keeping. I mean, there's a whole lot about mental cases, in inverted commas, in these case files that is deeply problematic. On the question of tone, there are plenty of instances of supplication when individuals wrote in what they called a humble fashion and requested UNHCR to show mercy. But they frequently coupled this approach with a calculated allusion to their human rights, including the right to a family life. Peter Konov-Nitsin, I can say why I use his full name rather than an abbreviated form, was a 53-year-old Russian refugee who had lived in Yugoslavia between the wars after leaving in 1919. His wife and son were allowed to go to the United States after the war, but a spot on his lung obliged him to stay in Germany. In 1954, he wrote he simply wanted to be able to join his wife, from whom he had been separated for 4 years. Quote, I have not committed any crime against humanity in my entire life, but where do I find the practical application of the humane laws of the 20th century in my case? I now implore your help so I can be reunited with my wife somewhere on earth. Don't you understand that my patience is worn out? He reiterated his plea. I hope that human rights law and the ideas articulated in the 20th century will enable me to live with my wife. Geneva simply said that the action rested with its Bonn office, but he was eventually admitted to the United States in 1958. And actually, I'm now in touch with his grandson. Alluding to human rights meant finding the right tone. Orfeo G., 28-year-old Angolan refugee who left Congo-Kinshasa in 1964 to study in Prague, appealed in 1968 to UNHCR as, quote, the protector of the rights of the weak and disadvantaged, and the defender of fundamental liberties. And a 30-year-old Zanzibar refugee, Dolly, wrote to Sadruddin, High Commissioner Sadruddin Aga Khan, from Karachi in 1967, prefacing her letter as follows. On the threshold of 1968, the International Year for Human Rights, which she wrote in block capitals, this, Ismaili, is appealing to you as one who needs guidance and help towards fulfillment of the contemporary accumulation of man's long struggles for all his basic values. And what she did there was to cite a work by Myers and McDougall, Studies in World Public Order, published by Yale University Press. That was all part of her letter. It was a carefully composed letter referring to the revolution in Zanzibar, but also including a scholarly reference to make sure that Sadruddin understood that he was dealing with someone with a higher education. There was no doubting Dolly's knowledge of international law or her willingness to go right to the top, and her proclivity for dramatic imagery. She got her wish and was granted American citizenship in 1982, so perhaps UNHCR could chalk this up as another victory. Other considerations were implicit in the composition of the case file. One crucial consideration concerns intrusion. I distinguish between voluntary and enforced intrusion. Voluntary intrusion occurs when an individual decides to disclose personal and even intimate information to a third party. Involuntary or enforced intrusion is when an individual has no choice except to provide such information as the price of being considered for recognition. But the most striking instances are those in which the case file demonstrates the shift from voluntary to enforced intrusion. And one such case exposed the personal costs involved. Superficially, it seemed fairly straightforward. In 1962, a Saudi-born man, 29-year-old Talib, then working for the American consulate in Algeria, approached UNHCR to explain that his extensive travels in Western Europe, Lebanon, and the United States, quote, had opened his eyes to the oppressive nature of the Saudi state. My social and political ideas were greatly enlarged and my general outlook widened. He found sanctuary in Sudan in 1957 and went on to marry Barbara, a young German woman. They were now living in Algeria with their 2 young children. They had no intention of returning to Saudi Arabia. How, Talib said, can I ask my wife to become a Muslim? as the conditions under which she would have to live are quite impossible as to rights and way of living in Saudi Arabia, especially for a European. UNHCR ruled that he came within the mandate and supported their wish to resettle. Tlaib went for broke by sending a handwritten letter to UN General Secretary U Thant mentioning his 2 small innocent children without nationality. He added, "I think our case is a lot easier than the Cuban crisis, but for us a worst, please do assist." The case file then began to bulge with further information. It included a copy of Stern magazine, the German magazine, which recounted the story of the marriage with the lurid headline. It left its readers in suspense. There is no end. A young woman spends her time along with her baby in a foreign land entirely dependent on help from foreigners. And Stern turned this into a cause célèbre in Germany. Having returned to Germany, filing for divorce, Barbara cited, quote, alleged maltreatment, physical and mental cruelty. When UNHCR first got to work on the case, there seemed little doubt that Saudi-born Tlaib qualified for refugee status. But a more complicated story subsequently came to light that brought matters into the public domain. Stern magazine offered an orientalized depiction of sexual exploitation and mistreatment. Barbara, it said, was a pretty, carefree girl before she fell into the hands of Tlaib. The magazine added a story of a white savior in the shape of Barbara's brother who rescued his sister from the clutches of an oppressive Arab husband. The story also connected to a growing fascination and anxiety about non-white Gastarbeiter, guest workers in Germany. So I present this as an illustration of multiple narratives, how an ostensibly straightforward instance of a claim for refugee status told of peripatetic journeys and various kinds of personal distress, how numerous actors got involved, and how UNHCR found itself out of its depth, to all intents and purposes ceding the story to the German magazine, which had its own agenda connected to gender and race. The story is uncomfortable on so many levels, including the fact that it is now in the public domain, and that although the protagonists disappeared from the published and unpublished record, they, and certainly their children, may well be alive. Intrusion of a different kind manifested itself by way of attempts by refugees to establish a personal connection. Although many treated UNHCR as an impersonal institution, refugees frequently identified a specific official, including writing, as did Dolly, directly to High Commissioner. Some of the most interesting cases arose where someone managed to conduct a correspondence in a more intimate fashion and literally engaged in exchange. A young Palestinian student, Abdullah, born in 1943 in a village close to Bethlehem, had been studying water management in Delhi since 1964 on an Indian scholarship. As part of his application for further financial support, he appeared to the Dutch diplomat, Briddick, who served as UNHCR's resident representative in the Indian capital. As Abdullah said, "My situation is deteriorating. I've tried all the corners of the world where I expected some help. Unfortunately, it seems to me," and he again wrote in capital letters, "all the doors are closed." But money was the least of his difficulties. The Indian government and the Jordanian ambassador were conspiring to get him to leave the country and return to Jordan. Abdullah continued, "What's my fault? I'm a Palestinian, was born in Palestine and lived there. I acquired the Jordanian passport because Jordan came in control of the West Bank, and I had no alternative but to acquire a Jordanian passport. I've never tried to interfere with Jordan's affairs, yet I'm not free from Jordan's interference in my personal affairs." And he followed this up with an attempt to ingratiate himself with Briddick by inviting him to dinner. "I intend to get some Arabic dish prepared especially for you. Note, on that expected day, please give special instructions to your stomach to give sufficient space for a rich dinner, I mean a thick one. I wish here to thank you for the dinner you offered me last week. It was very tasty and delicious. I feel we should meet more often, as much as convenient to you, because I feel totally relaxed and pleased when we are together. His subsequent letters became altogether more formal. He outlined run-ins with the Indian authorities, which accused him of undermining India by supporting Pakistan. He admitted that he'd taken part in the occupation of the Jordanian embassy in protest against the massacres of Palestinian refugees. Aman sought revenge by asking India to cancel his student visa. Relations with the embassy reached rock bottom and even placed him in physical danger. In fact, he said, the embassy secretary followed me and drove so close to me, if I did not jump out of the road, I would have been run over by his car. Abdullah then changed tack. I wish to mention that UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA helps Palestinians in Jordan who all carry Jordan's passport. Your office helps defectors from east to west because they differ ideologically with their governments. Here, I differ politically with Jordan, and it's not my country nor my government, so why should I not be helped? I differ with Israel for its theocratic ideology and forcible occupation of my country, and therefore I cannot go there. Please think of me, again, as a Palestinian and as a Palestinian refugee only, nothing else, trying to build myself to be able to exist. He added, for emphasis, please note that my previous letters should be read thoroughly. UNHCR initially took the view that he was obliged to return to Jordan, as Geneva put it, to fulfill his commitment of service to Jordan in Jordan. But in the light of documents that Abdullah now presented, UNHCR had a change of heart. Observing the facts as now presented put a different complexion on the matter altogether. By his participation in demonstrations and the generally hostile attitude of the ambassador of the past few months, there can be little doubt that he would fear persecution in Jordan. Briddick, the representative in Delhi, repeated his view that he was, quote, a deserving case for assistance. And in 1971, Geneva approved a grant to enable him to remain enrolled at Delhi School of Economics, as per what it described as special circumstances. But Abdullah's remarkable attempt to cultivate a personal relationship with someone in authority and his persistence eventually paid off. Persistence meant more than rhetorical effort. Abdullah bombarded UNHCR with documentation about his political views, his precarious financial situation, his status as a Palestinian refugee, and his awareness of UNHCR's policy. All of this recorded in the case file. But why did Briddick take the initiative in inviting Abdullah to dinner in the first place, which then prompted Abdullah to reciprocate? Was there something about him that triggered memories of Briddick's own mistreatment at the hands of the Nazi regime that had punished him for resistance in wartime Holland? At some point, Abdullah did return to Jordan because an online search indicates that someone with the same name, signing himself now as doctor, was living and working as an engineer in Amman as of 2021. So refugees didn't hesitate to invoke rights and to demonstrate an awareness of international refugee law. For example, Monsef wrote to Sadruddin from Rome in December 1969, saying that he was a former Tunisian activist, a militant, who had fought for his country's independence from 1946 to 1956 and had been tortured by the French. He left Tunisia in January 1962, having come to oppose what he called the tyrannical and corrupt regime of the traitor Habib Bourguiba, which exceeded, in his view, quote, the colonial yoke in its villainy. He left his friends and his job and went to France before moving to Algeria in 1965. He absolutely refused to entertain returning to Tunisia under a government amnesty. He cited the Declaration of Human Rights in support of being allowed to live in freedom, but he'd come to realize, as he put it, the world was full of hypocrisy and lies. He traveled to Rome, but was given only a temporary 1-month residence permit. He wanted Sadruddin to protect him from expulsion. And he met with La Pena, the UNHCR representative in Rome, but his reaction to being told that he would not be recognized as a refugee was, in La Pena's words, very unpleasant. Le Pen had told Geneva that Monsef had threatened to go to the media with his complaints. UNHCR reaffirmed its view that he had not cited sufficient specific detail to support a claim of well-founded fear of persecution in Tunisia, either in written submissions or during numerous interviews, has simply, quote, alleged persecution. UNHCR insisted on the need for supporting evidence. Monsef, in turn, insisted on his rights. This reached an impasse and the case closed, with no record of Monsef's future having come to light, although ancestry indicates that someone with the same name did end up back in France. Other refugees referred to the need for UNHCR to be accountable for its actions. An ill-tempered exchange took place in 1971 between Anthony, a refugee from Biafra, who launched a lengthy correspondence with Antoine Noel, the Ethiopian national who served as UNHCR's regional representative in Lomé. Anthony explained that he had, quote, absconded Lagos in July 1969, quote, at the heat of war and on grounds of insecurity of life and interminable harassment of my ethnicity by the army. He didn't hold back. The charge of opportunist against me stems from deep-rooted hatred, malice, and deliberate distortions directed towards me. I know that you and your informants have your favorites whose interests you are determined to promote at all costs. I do not quarrel with you, but you are violating the principle of objectivity in the assessment of human situations and problems, which does no credit to your person or to your office. And signed off with a flourish, only Almighty God is competent to determine my fate. And he then wrote to the High Commissioner, Sadruddin, accusing Noel of corruption and discrimination. Mr. Noel is not moved by the plight of famishing children and pregnant women. Maybe our dark skin justifies the torture. All he itches for is my extermination. But he made little headway. Albert Peters, the acting chief of the West Africa desk, wrote, quote, that sympathetic though we may be to your situation as a refugee, you will no doubt appreciate our difficulty in entering into a detailed discussion of the facts mentioned in your case. Sadruddin said, was this the mental case? Presumably, Noel was following the cautious line laid down by UNHCR in regard to Biafran refugees, unless they were refugees sur place. Perhaps Anthony was right to portray himself as the victim of discrimination, but the entire saga suggests how UNHCR closed ranks and how an individual could unleash a torrent of invective, having no other means at his disposal. So the case files in Geneva can be understood in part as belonging to a familiar legal and bureaucratic terrain. In relation to refugee eligibility determination, they can be read alongside the accumulated records of the IRO or the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless Persons, l'OPFRA, whose records have been used to great effect by Karen Akoka and others. The surviving written record gives a good sense of evolving policy and practice. To mention just one instance of its initiative, the accumulation of evidence in the case files about the situation of refugee seafarers led UNHCR to play a prominent role in the international agreement reached at The Hague in 1957. The case files also reflect the agency's self-justification. Its decision-making vis-à-vis refugee creating and refugee hosting states, as well as instances in which it exercised a degree of discretion in reaching decisions on eligibility. The case files also demonstrate how refugees fashioned a narrative of displacement and persecution. They disclose the terms of the encounter between officials and refugees. Many individuals regarded UNHCR as a point of entry to make themselves heard, even if they were quickly shown the door. But the conversation did not necessarily flow in one direction. The archival record reveals the exchange of views between officials and refugees grasp of their rights. Returning to the book, Refugee Voices in Modern Global History, of course, I detect change over time in the refugee regime. The emphasis on individual eligibility for recognition, for protection and assistance broke with previous practice. It found expression in the creation of individual case files, and although the IRO had already begun to keep a record of its decisions, UNHCR's longevity contributed to a much more extensive archival record. Another crucial departure was reflected in the accumulation of correspondence from persons across the globe who saw UNHCR as a source of support. This was different in scale and scope from the League of Nations refugee regime. It meant that UNHCR heard from individuals who understood precisely what the organization represented, and from others who embarked on a more speculative quest for assistance or justice. Just because their claims might get short shrift in Geneva does not diminish their wider significance. Their witness accounts were filed away and provide the historian with evidence of UNHCR's decision-making. But they do more than this. They created a record of conflict and upheaval in the 20th century and the impact on societies and on the lives of individuals whom we can now see as more than just cases. Thank you.